The morning Rose's world ended. The lavender was in bloom. She noticed it because she always noticed small things. The way the light fell through the warped glass of the front window, the particular slant of early sun that turned the dust motes golden, the faint sweetness threading through the smell of old paper and beeswax that had defined every morning of her 24 years. The lavender grew in a cracked clay pot beside the door, planted by her mother's hands a decade before her mother's hands had gone cold. Rose watered it every morning without thinking. Habit. Love. The same thing sometimes. She was on the stepladder behind the counter when she heard the horses, not the ordinary clatter of merchants or travelers passing through Veyrath's narrow streets. This was different. This was the sound of many hooves moving in unison, iron-shod and deliberate, the kind of synchronized rhythm that belonged to soldiers, or worse. Rose steadied herself against the highest shelf and tilted her head. Through the warped glass, shapes moved. Dark shapes. Too many of them. She climbed down slowly. The bookshop, Ilara's books, named for her mother, occupied the ground floor of a narrow stone building at the edge of the market quarter. It was not a grand place. The shelves were mismatched, repaired with different woods over the years, and the spines of the oldest volumes had faded to near illegibility. But every book had its place. Every corner had its smell. The ceiling beams were low and dark with age, and the single reading chair beside the hearth had a depression worn into the cushion from decades of use. Rose knew this room the way she knew her own heartbeat. She reached the door, just as the first guard's fist struck it from the outside. The impact rattled the frame hard enough to knock a small volume from the nearest shelf. Rose caught it by instinct, Herbal Remedies of the Northern Provinces, 3rd edition, and set it carefully on the counter before lifting the latch. The guard was enormous. Behind him, the street was full. 12 riders at minimum, in the black and silver livery of the Crown Pack. Behind them, on a massive gray destrier, sat a man Rose had never seen in person, but recognized immediately. Everyone in Veyrath would have recognized him. The portraits did not do justice to the reality of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the cold precision of his expression, the way the morning light seemed to sharpen against the hard planes of his face rather than soften them. His eyes, even from this distance, were pale, almost colorless. Alpha King Tristan of the Northern Throne. Rose held the door open and said nothing. Her heart was hammering, but her face had learned stillness early, in the years after her mother died, and her father's grief turned him into a man who needed managing. She kept her expression composed. By order of His Majesty, the guard announced, his voice carrying for the benefit of the small crowd already forming at a careful distance. This building and all adjacent structures are hereby seized under the Crown Consolidation Act. Occupants have 1/4 hour to remove personal effects before demolition proceeds. Rose heard the words. She understood each one individually, but the arrangement of them made no sense. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could you repeat that?" The guard did not repeat it. He held out a folded document, heavy paper, black wax seal, and Rose took it because her hands moved before her mind caught up. She unfolded it. The legal language was dense and dispassionate, but the meaning was clear enough. The Crown required this entire block for the construction of a new garrison extension. The seizure had been approved 3 weeks ago. Notices had been sent. Rose had received no notice. She looked up from the paper, past the guard, past the assembled soldiers. Her gaze found the Alpha King on his gray horse, and she felt something quiet and precise settle into place inside her chest. Not panic, not anger yet, just a crystalline recognition of how catastrophically wrong this moment was. "I received no notice," she said. The guard's expression didn't shift. The notice was posted in the public registry, as required by law. "I am the owner of record of this property. Direct notice is also required by law." A brief pause. The guard glanced back toward the king. Rose could not read whatever passed between them. The king had not moved, had not spoken, was watching her with those pale eyes, and an expression that communicated nothing at all. "You have 1/4 hour, the guard repeated. Rose stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and went back inside. She did not run. She moved through the shop the way she always moved, deliberately, knowing where everything was without looking, her hands finding familiar surfaces. She went to the back room first, where her father's old lockbox sat under the floorboard. Inside, her mother's ring, a small amount of coin, the original deed to the building, and 3 letters she had kept for 10 years because they were the last things her mother had written. She put all of it into the worn leather satchel that lived on the hook by the back door. Then she stood in the middle of the shop and looked at 10,000 books. 1/4 hour. She began to move, not with efficiency. There was no efficiency possible here, but with a kind of desperate grief, pulling the most irreplaceable volumes from their shelves, first editions, handwritten herbals, the 2 illuminated manuscripts her father had traded half a year's income to acquire, her mother's own annotated copies of the healing texts she had used in her work. Her hands were shaking now. The composure was cracking at the edges, and she was aware of it, but had no resources to spare for managing it. She was on her 3rd armload when she heard it. Not the guards returning. Something else. A sound from the alley that ran alongside the building. Thin, ragged, almost inaudible beneath the noise of horses and armor and the growing crowd. Rose stopped, set the books down carefully on the counter, stood still and listened. There it was again. A whimper. Small, exhausted. She went to the side door, the narrow one that opened onto the alley, and pulled it open. The pup was barely visible in the shadow between the building and the alley wall. It had wedged itself into the narrowest corner, a small gray shape trembling so hard she could see the movement from the doorway. Shifter-born, clearly. Even in pup form, the structure was distinct from a natural wolf. The proportions slightly different, the eyes too aware. It couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks shifted. Far too young to be alone, and it was hurt. Even from here she could see the unnatural angle of one foreleg, and the dark matting of fur that meant a wound that had been bleeding for some time. Rose didn't think. She crouched down and held out her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The way her mother had taught her, the way the old healer texts described, the way she had practiced on every injured creature that had ever found its way to her door. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly. "Come here." The pup looked at her with those too aware eyes for a long moment. Then, shaking, it crawled forward and pressed its nose against her palm. She gathered it up with the careful efficiency of someone who had set broken bones in small animals before. The pup whined once, sharply, when she moved the leg. She murmured apologies without stopping. She carried it inside and laid it gently on the reading chair, on the cushion with the worn depression, and went to find her kit. The kit was always in the same place. Left drawer, back room, behind the spare candlestock. Her mother's kit, expanded over the years with Rose's own additions: linen bandaging, gut thread, bone-setting rods, comfrey salve, yarrow tincture, the specific wolfsbane-free antiseptic paste that worked on shifter tissue without causing a rejection reaction. Rose had learned the difference between treating shifted tissue and human tissue by the age of 14. The knowledge had been useful more times than she could count. She was splinting the foreleg. The pup had gone quiet in that specific way that meant trust or exhaustion, or both, when the door opened. Not the guard's knock this time. The door simply opened. She didn't look up. Her hands were occupied, and the splint needed to be set precisely, or the bone would heal wrong. The 1/4 hour has passed. The voice was low, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to fill a room. "I'm aware," Rose said. "I'll be finished in approximately 4 minutes." Silence. She could feel him in the room, the specific weight of a powerful alpha's presence, the way the air changed, a pressure at the edges of perception that her body registered even when her mind was elsewhere. She kept her hands steady, pressed the splint into place, began rapping. "That pup," the king said, and something in his voice shifted. A fracture, almost imperceptible, in the controlled surface of it. "Where did you find it?" "Your alley," Rose said, "or rather, what used to be my alley." She tied off the bandage, smoothed the fur around it gently, reached for the yarrow tincture. "The wound is a few hours old, infected, but not critically. The leg is a clean break. It will heal well if it's kept still for 4 days. Don't let him shift back yet." She finally looked up. Tristan stood 3 feet away, and he was looking at the pup in the reading chair, with an expression that was nothing like the one she had seen from the street. The cold precision was still there, but underneath it, visible only because she was close enough and paying attention, was something that looked, unmistakably, like terror. "That is my son," he said. Rose looked at the pup, then at the king. Then she set down the tincture very carefully, because her hands had started shaking again, and she didn't want to spill it. "He's going to be fine," she said. And then, because she was who she was, and she had learned that truth was more useful than tact, no thanks to whoever was supposed to be watching him. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. Rose understood this approximately 2 seconds after the words left her mouth, when she saw the nearest guard's hand move to his sword hilt, and the second guard take a step forward from the doorway. She did not retract the statement. She held Tristan's gaze with the same steadiness she had used to hold the pup still during the splinting, deliberate, calm, unwilling to flinch, because flinching now would accomplish nothing, and the pup needed to stay quiet. Tristan raised one hand. The guard stopped. He was still looking at his son. The pup had fallen into the shallow, twitching sleep of the recently injured small chest, rising and falling against the worn cushion. One gray ear was folded back. The bandaged leg rested at a careful angle, exactly as Rose had positioned it. "He slipped his escort 3 hours ago," Tristan said. His voice had returned to its controlled surface, but the effort was faintly visible now, the way a river's current is visible when the water is clear enough. "We have been searching the entire market quarter." "He came in through the drainage gap at the base of the alley wall," Rose said. "There's a loose stone. He would have smelled the books, probably. Paper and leather. Curious pups find it interesting." She paused. "Also the lavender." Tristan looked at her then. Fully. It was a different kind of looking than the pale-eyed assessment from horseback. This was closer and more complicated, and Rose found that she preferred the distance. "You know shifter medicine," he said. "My mother was a healer. She treated anyone who came to her door, shifted or not." Rose began packing her kit with methodical hands, giving herself something to do that wasn't meeting his gaze. She believed the knowledge shouldn't be kept only for packs with coin enough to pay a proper physician. Silence. Then, "Your name." "Rose Veyrath." She closed the kit. "Though I suppose it no longer matters what my name is, since in approximately 10 minutes this building will be rubble." She hadn't intended bitterness. It came out anyway. Clean and precise. Not theatrical. Just true. She saw something move across Tristan's expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt and less comfortable. "The consolidation order was legal," Rose said. "I know. I read the document." She lifted her satchel from the counter and settled it across her shoulder. "I'm not arguing the legality. I'm stating the consequence. My mother built this shop. My father kept it after she died. I've kept it for 6 years since he followed her. There are books in this room that exist nowhere else in the Northern Territories." She looked at him steadily. "I'll be out of your way within the hour." She meant to walk past him toward the door. She made it 2 steps. "Stop." It wasn't a request. It wasn't quite a command either. It occupied the precise space between the two. The register of a man who had spent so long being obeyed that the distinction had become academic. Rose stopped. Not because she was afraid, but because something in his voice had changed again, and she was constitutionally incapable of ignoring a change that seemed important. "The pup cannot be moved yet," Tristan said. Rose turned. 4 days of stillness, as I said. After that, he cannot be moved today. He looked at his son again, and the fracture in his control widened slightly. Just slightly, just enough. "He is 7 weeks shifted. His first shift came early, and we are still. The healers at the keep have not—" He stopped. Began again. "He is fragile. The journey back to the keep is 3 hours by carriage. Moving him now, with an unset bone, over that road, would risk the bone shifting before it stabilizes," Rose finished. She looked at the pup, looked at the king, exhaled once, slowly, through her nose. "I understand." She set her satchel down. Tristan watched her do it. Something in his posture altered, a fractional release of tension that he probably wasn't aware of, the kind of adjustment the body makes when a threat recedes. "The demolition will be postponed," he said. "For 4 days." "Yes." And after 4 days? His jaw tightened. The order stands. Rose nodded once. She had known the answer before she asked, but she had needed to hear it stated clearly, because clarity, even painful clarity, was preferable to ambiguity. She pulled her mother's annotated herbal from the pile on the counter, the one she had already packed, and set it next to the reading chair where she could reach it easily. "Then I'll need a cot," she said, "and a fire kept through the night. He'll need monitoring. The infection could worsen before it improves, and shifted pups run fevers differently than humans. If it spikes, someone needs to be here who knows what to do." Tristan looked at her with that complicated expression again. "You're volunteering to remain. I'm volunteering to keep your son alive for the next 4 days." She sat down on the low stool she used when she worked at the reading chair, the one that had served as her mother's examination seat for years, and opened the herbal to the section on shifter tissue inflammation. "Whether you consider that volunteering or hostage-keeping is, I suppose, a matter of perspective." A long pause. Then, from the doorway, she heard something she had not expected, the soft exhale of a man containing something that might, in different circumstances, have been a surprised sound. She did not look up from the page. By nightfall, the shop had been transformed into something between a sick room and an armed camp. 2 guards remained inside, positioned near the door with the rigid discomfort of men accustomed to open air and not narrow rooms full of books. A cot had been brought, along with a proper hearth grate, candles of actual quality, rather than the tallow stubs Rose usually managed with, and, inexplicably, mysteriously, a covered tray of food that contained hot soup, bread that was still warm, and a portion of the kind of soft cheese that cost more than Rose spent on food in a week. She ate without ceremony, sitting cross-legged on the cot with the bowl balanced on her knee, watching the pup sleep. He had not shifted back. That was good. The human form would have put strain on the healing bone that the pup form could better manage. He had woken once, briefly, and looked at her with those 2 aware eyes, and she had spoken quietly and offered water from a shallow bowl, and he had drunk from it in small, exhausted sips before sleeping again. "His name is Emmerich," said a voice from the doorway. Rose glanced up. Tristan stood at the threshold. He had not entered, she noticed, had remained on the boundary of the room, as if observing some rule she hadn't articulated. He had removed his riding coat. In plain dark wool, he looked less like a portrait and more like a man, though the authority he carried was intrinsic enough that it survived the change of clothing without difficulty. "Emmerich," Rose repeated. She looked at the sleeping pup. "It suits him. You know that from a pup in wolf form. He crawled toward me when he didn't have to. That takes a certain kind of stubbornness." She returned to her book. The stubborn ones usually have strong names. Another silence. These silences were acquiring texture, she noticed, each one slightly different from the last, shaped by whatever was happening in the spaces between what was said. "His mother died," Tristan said, 8 weeks ago. The shift came early because of the grief. The healers believe the trauma accelerated it. Rose was still. Her hand rested on the open page, but she was not reading. "He is 7 weeks old in shifted form," Tristan continued, "and already he is slipping escorts and wedging himself into drainage gaps in strange alleys." Something moved in his voice, something that was grief and pride tangled together so thoroughly they had become inseparable. "She would have said he gets it from me." Rose did not look up. She understood, with the specific instinct of someone who had lost both parents and learned to navigate the specific minefield of other people's grief, that looking up was not what this moment required. "The yarrow tincture I applied will need to be reapplied at dawn and at midday tomorrow," she said quietly. "The comfrey and the salve will start working within the next few hours. You'll notice the swelling reduce. If he wakes and seems distressed, particularly if he starts pawing at the bandage, send for me immediately. Don't let the guards unwrap it. Understood?" A pause. "You speak about this as if you've done it many times." "I have." She turned a page. "My mother believed that knowledge existed to be used. I believed her." She heard him exhale slowly, then the sound of his weight shifting, a boot on the old wooden floor. "The food. Was it acceptable?" Rose looked at the empty bowl. It was the best soup I've eaten in approximately 3 years. I'll have the same scent tomorrow. She almost said there's no need. The words were already formed, the reflex of someone who had spent 6 years being careful about accepting things she couldn't repay. She stopped herself, set the reflex aside. "Thank you," she said instead, and meant it precisely and without performance. She heard him leave. She sat in the firelight for a long time after, listening to the small sounds of the pup breathing and the guards shifting their weight and the last of the market quarter noise fading outside, and she thought about the lavender in the cracked clay pot beside the door, and whether, when the building came down in 4 days, she would have anywhere to take it. The answer, when she let herself look at it directly, was no. She had the satchel. She had the kit. She had 6 years of knowledge, and her mother's ring, and a small amount of coin and a deed to a building that would be rubble before the week was out. She was 24 years old, and she had nothing left to lose. That thought should have terrified her. Instead, sitting in the warmth of a fire she hadn't had to pay for, watching a small gray pup breathe evenly on her mother's reading chair, Rose felt something she didn't immediately have a name for settle into her chest like ballast. It felt, peculiarly, like the beginning of something. On the second day, Emmerich shifted back. Rose heard the change before she saw it. The specific sound of small bones rearranging, the sharp intake of breath that accompanied the transition, and then a boy's voice saying something that sounded like a curse word in the old Pack dialect, muffled against the reading chair cushion. She set down the volume she had been cataloging. She had spent the morning making a written inventory of every irreplaceable book in the shop, a record that would survive even if the objects themselves did not, and crossed the room. The boy looking up at her from the chair was perhaps 4 years old in human form, dark-haired, pale-eyed. His father's eyes exactly, she noticed, though in this face they carried less weight and more confusion. He was wrapped in the blanket she had tucked around the wolf form the night before, and his right arm was held at the careful angle of someone who had woken to find it bandaged and splinted, and was deciding how to feel about that. "Don't move the arm," Rose said. He looked at her with his father's measuring expression and said, in a voice that was solemn and slightly hoarse, "You smell like lavender and old paper." "You smell like a wolf who's been sleeping on a reading chair for 2 days," Rose replied. "Are you hungry?" A pause while he considered the social implications of admitting vulnerability to a stranger. Then, quietly, "Yes." She fed him broth and bread torn into small pieces, seated on the low stool beside the chair, and he ate with the focused intensity of a child who had been too unwell to eat properly for longer than 2 days. She watched the color come back into his face, the specific warmth that meant the fever had broken, the infection turning, the body winning its argument with the wound. "Are you the healer?" he asked, around a piece of bread. "I'm a bookseller," Rose said, "but I know some healing." He looked at the shelves with their thousands of spines. "That's a lot of books." "Yes." "Do you know what's in all of them?" "Most of them." He thought about this with visible seriousness. "My father says knowing things is how you keep power when you don't have the biggest teeth." Rose looked at this 4-year-old child and felt something shift in her chest, a small, involuntary movement, the kind that happened before the heart had time to consult the mind about whether it was wise. "Your father is right," she said. Tristan arrived mid-morning with 2 healers from the keep. She heard the horses and went to the door, and found him dismounting with the specific controlled efficiency of a man who had been riding hard and was not going to show it. He came inside without knocking this time, and went directly to his son, and the expression on his face when Emmerich looked up and said, "Papa," with bread still in his hand, was not something Rose catalogued because it felt private in a way that didn't belong to her. She gave them the room. She went to the back room and worked on her inventory, listening without meaning to, as the low murmur of Tristan's voice reached her through the thin wall, the specific tone fathers used when they were frightened and were choosing not to show their children how frightened they had been. The healers examined Emmerich and confirmed what Rose had already known. The break was clean, the infection retreating, the splint correctly set. She heard one of them saying so in a voice pitched to Carrie, directed at her she understood through the wall, in a tone that contained a particular note of professional surprise that she chose to interpret generously. Tristan appeared in the doorway of the back room while the healers were still with Emmerich. Rose did not look up from her inventory ledger. The bone will be stable enough for careful carriage travel in 2 more days. Not tomorrow. The healers concur. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the room. The bare shelves she had already stripped of the most important volumes. The stacked crates she had been filling methodically. The orderly evidence of a life being packed away. You've been cataloging. A record should exist. She wrote a title, a date, a condition notation. Even if the objects don't. Rose. She stopped writing. He almost never used her name. Had used it once, the first day, and then retreated to silence or implication. The sound of it in his mouth was different from how she said it herself inside her head. Fuller somehow, weighted differently. She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with an expression that had dropped most of its careful layers. Not entirely, not the deep ones, but enough that she could see he was working toward something, and finding the approach difficult. The consolidation order covers this block, he said. It doesn't cover the building 3 streets east, on the Millward corner. The property is crown-held. It has been empty for 2 years. A pause. It is larger than this space. The structural condition is sound. There is a back room adequate for the kind of work you do. Rose was very still. I'm not offering charity, he said, which told her that he had anticipated her exact objection and had decided to address it preemptively. The property needs a tenant, a bookseller, one who is also a competent healer and is known in the market quarter, is a useful tenant. There would be a formal lease, standard terms. Favorable terms, Rose said. Reasonable terms. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, and she had the sense that this was a man who did very few things he didn't intend to do, and that the offering of this particular thing had been considered carefully before it was spoken. You're doing this because of Emmerich, she said. I'm doing this because a shop that has served this quarter for 20 years and contains books that exist nowhere else in the Northern Territories is worth preserving. A beat. And because of Emmerich. Rose returned to her ledger, wrote one more line. I'll see the property before I agree to anything. Tomorrow morning. Emmerich stays on the chair until we go. I'm not finished monitoring the fever pattern. Agreed. She heard him push off the doorframe and move back toward the front room. She sat with her pen hovering over the page for a moment, not writing, listening to the sound of him speaking to his son in that low murmur that she had been trying not to overhear all morning. She wrote, This is not safety. This is proximity. They are not the same thing. Then she closed the ledger and went back to her inventory. That evening she found the letters. She had been working through the lowest shelf of the back room, the one she had always called her mother's shelf, where the oldest and most personal volumes lived, when her hand found a small wooden box she had not thought about in years. She knew what was inside before she opened it. She opened it anyway. Her mother's correspondence, tied in ribbon, organized by year. Her mother had been meticulous. Rose had never read all of it. Some of it she had read at 12, put away, understood she was too young for yet. Some of it she had meant to return to and never had, because the years had accumulated and the shop had needed managing and grief had a way of becoming load-bearing, structural. A thing you stopped examining because you needed it to hold you up. The letter on top was not in her mother's handwriting. Rose unfolded it slowly. The paper was heavy, the kind used for formal correspondence, and the date in the upper corner was from before Rose was born. The seal, broken, long ago by her mother's careful hands, was a physician's mark she didn't recognize. She read it once, read it again, sat down on the floor between the shelves with the letter in her hands and read it a third time, because the words were not arranging themselves into a meaning she was willing to accept on first reading. The letter was addressed to her mother. It described, in formal and clinical language, the results of an examination. It described a child. It described certain markers, the specific terminology of pack bloodline assessment, which Rose understood because her mother had taught her, and the conclusion the examining physician had reached. The child described was Rose. The markers described were not those of an ordinary human healer's daughter. Rose sat on the floor of the back room, while the candle burned lower, and the fire in the front room crackled, and the guards shifted their weight, and Emmerich slept in the reading chair. And she held a letter that told her, in the careful, impersonal language of a physician who had died before she could ask him any questions, that her mother had known something about Rose's nature and had chosen not to tell her, that she was not entirely what she had believed herself to be, that somewhere in her blood, dormant, unactivated, unexplained, was a lineage her mother had spent 20 years protecting her from knowing about. She put the letter back in the box, put the box in her satchel, sat in the dark for a long time. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went to check Emmerich's fever, because the fever was real and present and required managing. And whatever the letter meant could wait until she had the stillness and the safety to look at it directly. She did not yet have either. The building on Millward Corner smelled like cold stone and disuse, and the particular dry emptiness of a space that had been waiting too long for someone to fill it. Rose walked through it slowly, running her fingers along the shelves that were already built into the walls. Whoever had occupied it before had also dealt in books, or documents, or both, and noting the structural things her mother had taught her to note: the load-bearing walls, the quality of the mortar, the way the light came through the windows at this hour. The back room was larger than her current back room. There was a separate entrance from the alley. The hearth was wide enough to heat the space properly. Tristan stood near the door and did not follow her through the rooms. She appreciated this more than she expected to. "The lease terms," she said from the back room doorway. "Standard market rate. 3 years minimum, renewable." He paused. "With a provision for medical services to be rendered as needed, at your discretion, to be credited against rent." Rose looked at him. "You want a house healer?" "I want Emmerich to have access to someone who knows shifted tissue and doesn't panic." Something moved in his expression. A dryness, almost. The Keep's physicians are competent. They are also terrified of him. He's 4 years old. He shifts without warning and bites when startled. They find it alarming. Rose thought about the small boy who had told her that knowing things was how you kept power when you didn't have the biggest teeth, and felt the involuntary chest movement again, the one that bypassed the mind's careful gatekeeping. "I would need my independence," she said. "The shop is mine. The hours are mine. I come when I choose to come, not when I'm summoned." "Agreed. And I want it in writing that the demolition order does not extend to any future property I occupy." "Also agreed." She studied him. He was standing in the thin morning light with his hands at his sides and his expression composed, and she was looking for the concealed cost of this, the thing he wanted that he hadn't named yet, the leverage hidden inside the reasonableness. She had learned early that when powerful men offered reasonable things, the unreasonable part usually came later. "Why?" she said. "I told you. You told me a reason. I'm asking for the real one." The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, quietly and with the specific weight of a man choosing precision over deflection, "Because you didn't run." Rose waited. "When I told you the order stood," he said. "When you understood what that meant. You didn't beg, you didn't threaten, you didn't perform distress for my benefit. You said you understood, and you sat down, and you went back to work." He looked at the far wall. "I have spent 4 years surrounded by people who perform every emotion they have for my benefit, or suppress every emotion they have for the same reason. You did neither." A pause. "I found it clarifying." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's an unusual reason to offer someone a lease. It's an honest one." She looked around the empty room, the waiting shelves, the wide hearth, the alley entrance, and thought about her mother's letters in the satchel and the physician's note she had read 3 times on the floor of the back room and still hadn't fully digested. And she thought about what it meant to accept something from a man whose soldiers had been 12 hours away from destroying everything she had. And she thought about the lavender in the cracked clay pot, which she had moved inside 2 nights ago, and which was sitting on the counter of the old shop, still alive. "I'll sign the lease," she said. The move took 2 days. Tristan sent 4 of his men to carry the crates, which Rose found simultaneously useful and deeply uncomfortable, and she directed them with the precise efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything went and was not going to explain herself twice. Emmerich supervised from a padded chair someone had carried in specifically for him, his splinted arm resting on a cushion, offering opinions on shelf placement with the authority of a child who had recently decided that the bookseller was a person whose space he had territorial feelings about. "The herbals should be near the window," he said, "because of the light." "The herbals need to be near the examination area," Rose said, "because of the practicality. But the light makes the covers look better." "The covers are not the point of herbals, Emmerich." He considered this with visible reluctance. "Fine. But the window shelf should have something with a nice cover." Rose looked at him, looked at the window, moved 3 volumes of natural philosophy, excellent covers, genuine gold leaf on the spines, to the window shelf. Emmerich looked satisfied. She went back to directing the crates. Tristan was not present for the move. He had returned to the keep the morning of the lease signing and sent a formal document back with his seal on it, which Rose had read completely, twice, before signing, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her to read everything before she put her name to it. The terms were exactly as stated. No hidden clauses. She had looked for them with professional suspicion, and found nothing. She was still looking for the cost. 3 weeks into the Millward shop, she found the second letter. She had been going through the wooden box methodically, 1 letter per evening, after closing, with the fire lit and the guards gone and the quiet of the new space settling around her. Most of the correspondence was ordinary: professional consultations, patient notes, the particular warm formality of healers writing to other healers across distance. Her mother's voice was in all of it, careful and precise, and occasionally funny in ways that made Rose's throat ache. The second significant letter was buried near the bottom, dated 2 years after the first. It was from her mother to someone whose name had been carefully, deliberately blotted out, not carelessly, not accidentally, but with the specific thoroughness of someone who was protecting a recipient. The letter described Rose again. Described what she was beginning to show, at age 2, in ways that her mother was managing quietly. Described a bloodline that carried certain capacities, not wolf-shifting, not that, but something older and less common. Something the letter called the sight of the between, the specific hereditary ability that certain bloodlines carried. The capacity to perceive what wolves could not. To read the threads of bond and blood and lineage in ways that even alphas with their scent reading could not fully replicate. Her mother had hidden it, because someone had wanted to use it. The letter didn't say who, the name was blotted, but the language was clear. "They will not stop looking," her mother had written, "and if they find her before she is old enough to protect herself, they will use her the way they used her father's line before her, and I will burn this building to the ground before I let that happen." Rose set the letter down on the counter very carefully. Her father's line. Not her mother's gift then, her father's blood. Her father, who had died quietly of grief 6 years ago, who had been a gentleman who loved books and had never once mentioned anything about bloodlines or capacities, or anyone looking for his daughter, or, and this landed in her chest like a stone into still water, he had been gentle because he had been frightened, because he had known, and had loved her enough to be silent, and the weight of the silence had been part of what had killed him. She sat with this for a long time. Then she went to the shelf where she kept the most technical of the pack lineage texts. 3 volumes her mother had acquired at significant cost, which Rose had read but never had specific reason to apply to herself. And she began to read them with new eyes. She was still reading at midnight when the knock came at the alley door, not the front entrance. The alley door, which very few people knew existed. Rose set down the volume and picked up the short iron poker from the hearth stand. Not because she knew how to fight, but because her hands needed something solid. And went to the door. "Who is it?" "Mira." A woman's voice, low and urgent. "Please. I was told you were a healer. I was told you don't turn people away." Rose opened the door. The woman was perhaps 30, dark-cloaked, clearly having moved fast through cold streets. She was supporting a child, a girl, perhaps 7, human form, but with the faintly luminous skin that meant shifted blood. The child was conscious, but barely, and her eyes, when they caught the firelight, were glassy with fever. Rose stepped back from the door without hesitation. "Bring her in. Lay her here." She was already moving to the kit before the woman had the child on the examination table, hands finding the familiar tools, mind shifting into the specific focus that her mother had called the clearing, the state where everything that wasn't the patient ceased to exist. "How long?" she asked. 4 days. The woman's voice cracked. "I didn't have coin for a physician, and the pack healer—" She stopped, started again. "The pack healer refused. She's not registered pack." Rose looked at the child's fever-flushed face, and the small hands curled against the table and felt, cleanly and without drama, the same anger that had been building in her for 3 weeks, since the letter, since the blotted name, since the phrase "they will use her," the way they used her father's line had taken up residence behind her sternum and refused to move. "Her name?" Rose asked. "Senna." Senna. Rose laid a cool cloth against the child's forehead and leaned close. "You're going to be all right. I need you to stay still for me." The child's glassy eyes found her face. Something in them steadied, that specific settling that Rose had seen before, in Emmerich, in the injured animals before him, in the patients who came to her mother in the night with nowhere else to go. The settling that happened when a frightened creature recognized that the person holding them was not afraid. Rose was not afraid. She was furious, and she was focused, and in her experience, those two things together were more useful than safety had ever been. She began to work. Behind her, she heard Mira exhale. A long, shaking breath that held the full weight of 4 days of terror, finally finding somewhere to put itself down. "Who sent you to me?" Rose asked without looking up. A pause. "A man at the keep gate," Mira said. "He said the bookseller on Millward Corner. He said she would help." Rose's hands stilled for exactly 1 second, then continued. She would think about that later. Right now, there was a child with a fever and a mother with nowhere else to go, and that was the only thing that mattered. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere in the dark, above the Millward rooftops, she could have sworn she heard horses. One horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, circling the block once before fading into the night. The name came to her on a Tuesday, in the middle of measuring yarrow. She had been working through the lineage text for 3 weeks with the systematic thoroughness her mother had taught her, cross-referencing, annotating, building the kind of careful architecture of understanding that didn't collapse under scrutiny. The wooden box had yielded 4 more letters by then, each one adding detail to the shape of what she was. The capacity her mother had called the sight of the between had a formal name in the oldest texts, Verath, from the Old Tongue, meaning approximately the one who reads the threads. It was hereditary, rare, and historically coveted by pack leadership for exactly the reason her mother had feared. A Verath could perceive bond lines between wolves, could read the integrity or corruption of a mate bond, could identify bloodline claims that wolves themselves couldn't smell. In political terms, it made her an instrument. In practical terms, it made her dangerous to anyone who had something to hide. The blotted name in her mother's letter, the recipient who had been protected by deliberate erasure, she had narrowed to 3 possibilities through context and date, and the specific formal register her mother used with certain correspondence. She was working towards certainty. She was measuring yarrow when the door opened, and Tristan walked in without knocking, which had become, over the past weeks, a habit she had decided to address eventually, and kept not addressing. And behind him came a man she had never seen. Older, gray-haired, with the bearing of pack counsel and eyes that moved across the shop with the specific assessment of someone cataloging threat rather than content. Rose set down the yarrow. "Lord Counsel Aldrich," she said, because she had read enough political histories to recognize the king's senior advisor on site. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." Aldrich's eyes sharpened. Tristan's expression did something complicated. "We need to speak with you," Tristan said. "You're speaking with me now, privately." He glanced at Mira's daughter Senna, who was sitting in the reading chair. Her reading chair, the one from the old shop, which Rose had carried personally. Working through a picture alphabet Rose had given her 3 days ago, when she had returned for a follow-up examination, and shown no inclination to leave. Senna was 7, and recovering, and apparently had decided the bookshop was hers. Rose had made no serious effort to argue. "Senna," Rose said, "back room. Take the alphabet." Senna went without complaint, with the serious obedience of a child who understood when adults needed the room. Rose looked at Tristan. "Well?" Aldrich spoke before Tristan could. "There is a faction within the Northern Council," he said, "that has been aware of your existence for some time, specifically of what you are." He paused with the precision of a man who was choosing each word individually. "They have been aware since before your mother moved to Veyrath. They allowed her to settle here because it was useful to know where the Veyrath was." Rose felt the cold move through her from the outside in. "The consolidation order," she said. "Was legitimate," Tristan said, and his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Something harder than the controlled authority. Something that sounded like anger being kept on a very tight leash. But it was also used. The faction on the council wanted you displaced. Without the shop, without your income, without the established position you held in the quarter, they expected you to be easier to approach, easier to pressure. His jaw tightened. "I did not know this when I signed the order. I signed it because it was presented to me as a straightforward consolidation. The specific block was chosen by the council subcommittee. I did not examine why. The silence in the room was substantial." "Who?" Rose said. Aldrich and Tristan exchanged a look. Then Tristan said, "Lord Farron. He holds 3 seats on the subcommittee and has been building a political network around the idea of acquiring certain hereditary capacities for crown use, through compulsion if necessary." Rose thought about her father, about the gentleness of him, the quietness, the grief that had killed him slowly. She thought about "they will use her the way they used her father's" line, and felt something that was not cold anymore, something that was very precisely hot, and clean, and clear. "My father," she said. "Was a Veyrath also," Aldrich confirmed. "A weaker expression of the capacity, but enough to be useful. Farron's predecessor used him for 12 years. When your father escaped, when he met your mother and she hid him, they lost the asset." He paused. "They have been patient. They have been patient for 24 years, Rose said, "waiting for me to be available." "Yes." She looked at the yarrow on the counter, at the shelves of books around her, at the wide hearth and the reading chair and the small shape of Senna's feet visible under the backroom door. She thought about her mother planting lavender in a cracked clay pot and teaching her daughter everything she knew about healing and about reading and about how to be useful so that she would never be nothing, would never be only an asset to be managed, would always have something of her own that no one could take. "What do you need from me?" she said. Tristan stepped forward, 1 step, deliberate, into the space between them that she had spent weeks maintaining. "I need you to testify before the full council," he said. "Farron has been careful. What he's built is technically legal. To dismantle it, I need the council to understand what was done, specifically, what the consolidation order was actually used for and why." He paused. "A Veyrath testifying to the corruption of a bond line claim is legally binding in Pack Court. Farron has been using fabricated lineage documentation to support his council seats. If you read it publicly and declare it false, he loses the seats," Rose said, "and the network collapses." "Yes." She looked at him. At the pale eyes that were entirely unguarded in a way she had not seen before, not performing composure, not managing distance, just looking at her directly and waiting. "And if I do this," she said, "I become publicly known as a Veyrath. There will be others who want to use me." "Yes," he said, "there will. You're not going to tell me that you'll protect me. I'm going to tell you that I will, but I understand that my telling you means very little given the circumstances." He exhaled slowly. "I am telling you anyway." Rose thought about resistance. The reflex toward it was strong, was structural, had been built over 24 years of managing alone. She examined it carefully, then she looked at what was underneath it, which was not the desire to be alone, but the terror of trusting the wrong person again. The bone-deep flinch away from a hand that might look open and close into a fist. She looked at Tristan's hands. She thought about the soup that had appeared without her asking, about the lease with no hidden clauses, about a man at the keep gate telling a frightened mother where to find the bookseller who would help, about the sound of a horse circling the block in the dark, and then moving away without stopping, as if checking rather than watching. "I'll testify," she said. "On one condition." "Name it." "Senna and her mother. They're PAC unregistered and they're being denied services they're entitled to under the protection laws. I want that remedied. Formally, with documentation, before I walk into that council chamber." Something crossed Tristan's face. Not surprise, she thought, but something that arrived after surprise had already come and gone. Something that looked, in the particular light of the Millward shop at this hour, like a man recognizing something he had been looking at for a long time without having the right word for it. "Done," he said. The council session was 3 days later. Rose wore her mother's ring and a dress she had never owned before, deep green wool, well-made, purchased with the first real profit the Millward shop had turned. And she walked into the chamber with the wooden box under her arm and her kit on her shoulder because she had decided that she was going in as herself, or not at all. Lord Farron was a broad man with a counselor's careful face and 20 years of practice at looking above the heads of people he considered beneath him. He looked above Rose's head when she entered. He stopped doing this approximately 4 minutes into her testimony, when she laid the first of the fabricated lineage documents on the table and described, in precise and clinical language, exactly what she perceived in its bond-line structure and exactly where the falsification occurred. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger or distress. She used the vocabulary her mother had given her, and the knowledge the lineage texts had confirmed, and the specific clear-eyed precision that she had been told, all her life, made her difficult. She had decided to be very difficult indeed. Farron was stripped of 2 council seats before the session closed. The third required a formal investigation that Aldrich confirmed would conclude within the month. The fabricated lineage documentation was voided. The 3 families whose PAC registrations had been manipulated through Farron's network were notified immediately. Senna and Mira's documentation arrived the same afternoon, sealed with the crown mark, delivered to the Millward shop by a guard who knocked rather than simply opening the door. That evening, Tristan came alone. No guards, no Aldrich. He knocked. That was new. And when Rose opened the door, he was standing in the ordinary dark of the Millward alley in plain clothes. And he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had put down something very heavy and was still feeling the shape of where it had been. Rose stepped back from the door. He came in and stood near the hearth and looked at the shelves the way Emmerich had looked at them the first time, taking inventory, she thought, of something other than books. "He asks about you," Tristan said. "Every morning. He wants to know if the bookseller has found any books with nice covers that also have useful information inside." Rose felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped trying to name. "Tell him I'm working on it. You could tell him yourself." She looked at the fire. "Tristan, I know," he said quietly. "I know what I'm asking is complicated. I know what you've survived, and I know what that does to a person's capacity for trust, and I'm not asking you to pretend any of that isn't real." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking you to let me be someone you test, not trust blindly. Test, over time, with the full right to walk away if I fail it." Rose thought about the mate bond she had read about in her lineage texts, the way the oldest descriptions of it talked not about destiny, but about recognition, the specific clarity of seeing a person accurately and wanting them anyway, not wanting the idea of them. Wanting the actual, difficult, real person. The one who said uncomfortable things and didn't flinch and kept the lavender alive. She had not let herself look directly at what she felt. She looked at it now. "You destroyed my shop," she said. "I did. You didn't know what you were doing, but you did it." "Yes. And you've spent 3 months trying to make it right without ever saying that's what you were doing." He was quiet. "That's either very arrogant," Rose said, "or very careful. I haven't decided which." "Both, probably," Tristan said. And the honesty of it, the lack of performance, the refusal to make himself better than he was, landed in her chest like something coming to rest after a long time in the air. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked at his face at close range, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand fully. "Emmerich needs someone consistent," she said. "Not a mother." He has her memory and that belongs to him. But someone consistent. Yes. And you need someone who will tell you when you're wrong. I've been told I need it. I've never successfully found it. That's because you're frightening. You're not frightened of me. No, Rose said, I'm not. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, not reaching for him, just placing her hand there, the way she placed her hand on injured creatures, to let them feel that the person holding them was steady. He went very still. She felt his heartbeat through the wool of his shirt, fast and even, and entirely real. I'm going to keep the shop, she said. I'm going to keep taking patients who come to the alley door. I'm going to keep reading things that make people uncomfortable. I know. And I'm going to finish reading my mother's letters. His hand came up and covered hers, carefully, without pressure. Just warmth. Take whatever time you need. She stood there for a long moment in the firelight of the Millward shop, in the space her mother had never seen, with the lavender on the sill and the books on the shelves and the wooden box sitting closed on the counter. And she felt the last of the holding on, the careful, structural, load-bearing grief that had kept her upright for so many years. Begin, very slowly, to release. Not because she was safe. She was not certain she would ever have the uncomplicated version of safe. But because the person beside her was real, and had been tested, and had not failed yet, and was looking at her like she was a thing worth seeing clearly. That, she decided, was enough to begin with. In the months that followed, Farron's network unraveled with the thoroughness of something that had been built on falsified foundations, which it had. The investigation Aldrich had promised concluded in 6 weeks, not 4. The third council seat was revoked. The 3 families restored to proper PAC registration, sent letters, which Rose kept in the wooden box alongside her mother's correspondence because they belonged there, in the company of things that had cost something and mattered. Emmerich's arm healed clean and straight, exactly as Rose had told him it would. He came to the Millward shop every 3rd day, with the regularity of a natural force, and the specific conversational intensity of a child who had decided that the bookseller was his personal librarian and intellectual resource. And Rose received him with the same steadiness she received everyone who came through her door. Directly, without performance, on exactly the terms that were real. Senna, fully registered and entitled to every protection the law afforded, became Emmerich's closest companion with the inevitability of 2 children who had both decided the bookshop was theirs and needed to negotiate the terms. Rose mediated these negotiations with the impartiality of a woman who found them, privately, the best part of her week. Mira became her assistant. She had steady hands and a good memory, and the specific, fierce loyalty of someone who had been helped when she had nowhere else to go. And Rose trained her in everything her mother had taught her, because knowledge existed to be used, and the using of it was how it survived. Tristan came every evening that he was in Veyrath. He knocked. He stayed for the length of time that felt right and left without being asked to. He argued with her about council politics and lineage law and the placement of certain books, and was wrong approximately as often as he was right, which Rose found exactly as satisfying as she had expected. He did not call her his Luna in any formal setting until she told him he could. She told him 6 months after the council session, on a cold morning with the lavender brown and dormant on the sill, and snow sitting on the Millward rooftops, standing in her shop with her mother's ring on her hand, and the wooden box empty, and every letter read and understood and put to rest. She told him quietly and directly, without ceremony, because she was who she was. He received it the same way. No performance, no drama, just the specific clarity of 2 people who had looked at each other accurately and decided that what they saw was worth choosing. The lavender came back in